everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Paideia Today. I am Dr. Bill Friesen, and as always, I am joined by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson, and we are moving into season 4, people. And today, what do we have before us? We have a highly polarizing author who has exerted a considerable influence on the 20th century. I know for a fact that Dr. Masson has his reservations about this author. I do too, but in different ways. And I'm talking perhaps obviously about Oscar Wilde, the polarizing Oscar Wilde. And the work in question we're looking at today is The Importance of Being Earnest, largely acknowledged to be his finest play. It is, if you don't know, it is a comedy. To some extent, it is a comedy of manners, but it's many different things in addition to that. And there's a lot to say on these fronts here. Oscar Wilde was writing at an extremely interesting time in Western cultural and Western literary history. And one of the reasons I was keen to talk about Oscar Wilde is that Oscar Wilde hands on a range of highly influential ideas which allow modernism to form up as it did after the First World War. And this all began with an interest I had in modernist literature back during my master's studies out west. And I was tracing the roots of modernism, and there are many roots to modernism, to be sure. But one of the most interesting roots of modernism is the aesthetics movement, and the individuals in there are known individually as the aesthetes. And if the aesthetes have a reigning king, it is none other than our Oscar Wilde. So at risk of being a little bit pedantic here, I just want to trace a bit of the evolution, cultural evolution of the 20th century and how this relates back to Oscar Wilde. First thing we need to say is that right now in 2021, we are not living in the postmodern age. I believe both you and I, Dr. Masson, have signaled this at various points in our conversations in the past. Most thinkers out there, whether they're philosophers or sociologists, anthropologists, or whomever, acknowledge that the postmodern era either ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89 or with the fall of the Twin Towers, and that we are now in a fundamentally different era as of yet with no name. There are parties out there who are fighting fiercely to have the names of their cultural movements attached to the current era, but the very fact that they can still have battles and can still disagree on exactly who we are culturally shows you that we are in process. This is a living cultural moment rather than one that has gone dead. Postmodernism, on the other hand, most thinkers can sit down, discuss the main salient features that identify postmodernism, and we can have a fair degree of consensus in the room as to what it is. So nothing is moving there anymore, i.e. the movement culturally is dead. It's identifiable.
Yes.
Now, postmodernism obviously has an overwhelming influence on culture, on art, on everything. Mm-hmm. And so understanding postmodernism and the nature of postmodernism for anybody who's serious about thinking is not optional. You have to know about postmodernism and the influence of postmodernisms, the sources of postmodernisms, so on and so forth. However, postmodernism did not spring ex nihilo. It came from certain roots, certain individuals, certain movements, certain groups, certain institutions. And I became frustrated during my master's studies with many postmodernists who did speak about the era they studied, they taught, and they researched as if indeed it had come without roots, which, by the way, is a typical identifying feature of postmodernism.
That's true.
Yeah. The modernists reject the past. The postmodernists don't even know about it. So this, in some senses, it wasn't surprising. So then, of course, we get to modernism and what constitutes modernism and what does not constitute modernism. That's a fundamental question for understanding postmodernism and, by way of extension, where we are right now. But postmodernism, which is the era between approximately 1918 and 1939, also didn't come out of nowhere. So I became very curious, where did it actually come from? So I began tracing those roots, and one of the most productive roots was the aesthetics movement. And so I realized very quickly, okay, I need to understand what the aesthetics were all about, because if I can understand that, I can understand a lot of things that are going on later on in the 20th century. Oscar Wilde proved to be invaluable for that. In fact, he became my prime object of study. This is not to say that I necessarily like the literature of Oscar Wilde or the theater of Oscar Wilde. But I do like the concepts and ideas that I can explore here because they're very useful to me. And finally, I'll end with this. I discovered a little bit to my shock and dismay that the aesthetes didn't spring ex nihilo. They too have roots. And this is where I come to the bottom of the well. I'm sure it goes down further than this, but it's the French symbolists. The French symbolists. The French symbolists, as the name implies, are a bunch of poets who were primarily writing out of Paris around the 1860s and 1870s. They consist of people like Mallarmé and Rimbaud, and most famously their king, Baudelaire. And they have a number of artistic and intellectual and philosophical notions that make them highly distinctive. And it is the influence of this school of thinking, this school of writing, and this school of poetry, which exerts an extremely, I would say, not just a profound influence. These people actually produce an English version of many of the same ideas, which gets called the aesthetics movement. But the aesthetics movement is derivative, and that's one of my big points here. So the symbolists are fascinated with symbolism, and a lot of people ask, why are poets in the modernist period so obsessed with symbols? Why is T.S. Eliot obsessed with symbols? Why is Ezra Pound obsessed with symbols? Why is Hilda Doolittle obsessed with symbols? Trace it all the way back, and you'll end up with the symbolists in 1860s, 1870s Paris.
And Yeats, for that matter.
And Yeats, for that matter. Yes, Yeats is obsessed with symbols. Where did that all come from? You can trace it straight back in a relatively direct line right back to these French symbolist poets. So if you get to know their tendencies, this throws a lot of light on developments in the 20th century. One of the things they wanted to talk about was there was a going argument amongst these people about the artificiality of language. So Mallarmé, for instance, wanted to turn lived real experience into artificial language. That was one of his objectives. Baudelaire wanted to take it the other way around. He wanted to start with language and turn it into, and bear with me here, a phenomenological construct, which had a reality unto itself. So it's freestanding in some senses, and experiments with that all his life, especially in Flowers of Evil. What else do I want to say about these people? They didn't like, the aesthetes and the symbolists did not like the middle classes, so much so that they essentially declared war on them. And this to me was also fascinating. Why is it that modern avant-garde artists nowadays continuously provoke middle-class sensibilities? Why did they set themselves out there as outliers? Certainly the influence of the Romantics is part of that. They like that outlaw figure. But the symbolists were much more programmatic about why they were provoking and insulting the values of the middle classes. They considered the middle classes, and I'm just looking at my notes here, they considered them to be crass, they considered them to be banal, they considered them to be wearyingly materialistic, they were simplistic, they were well-meaning, but ineffectually well-meaning. They're hypocritical. They are, as I've already said, they're venal. Their values, in other words, the symbolists and the aesthetes thought the values of the middle classes must not make its way into proper respected art, because that would corrupt the art, because all these sorts of things dumb down the art, make the art simplistic, etc., etc., etc. So how do they respond? You already know the answer to this one. They invest themselves in sort of a dandy culture. I don't know if our listeners know what a dandy is. A dandy is usually a young man, usually from at least an intellectually formidable background. They indulge themselves in a life of pleasure and the arts, and they are highly, highly, highly provocative. This is coming straight out of symbolist culture. Symbolist culture is also the culture that gives us the infamous, the name escapes me right now. I was going to say vaudeville culture, but it's not vaudeville culture. It's the culture of the can and this sort of thing as it arises in the latter part of the 19th century in France. These things tend to be situated in very sketchy venues, oftentimes houses of prostitution and things of that sort. The name will come back to me, no doubt. But Baudelaire was a regular at all these sorts of things and himself lived a life of pleasure, predictably died of alcoholism and syphilis at a relatively young age. Anyway, so
Bill, this is really interesting as a discussion for our audience, because One of the many challenges people face when they study anything in the university is this, even the term modern, and it has so many different meanings in so many different areas, and has been used for a very long time in different periods to refer to different things. And so we're talking about literature now. But even in the context of literature, the word modern has been used before now. Like the Quarrel of the Ancients and the Moderns of the French Academy in the late 17th century and into the 18th century, the Battle of the Books, as Swift puts it, that's been there. And moderns there just simply means the current, the fashionable,
Yep.
like in mode in the in French. And so what's ever present and fashionable, that's modern. This is a very different meaning. In philosophy, it probably refers to the philosophy of René Descartes, and the modernist turn towards the cogito as the grounding basis for grounding knowledge and so forth. I think, therefore I am.
Yeah, cogito ergo sum.
Yeah, that is not what we're talking about here. And when we're coming to literature in particular, the modernist period is a very specific era and tied with this. And what then is challenging then is, if we're going to talk about postmodernism, is to differentiate a literary response from a literary movement. And you're suggesting a stronger legacy from a literary movement than most people are going to want to grant. They're going to see it as a broader philosophical malaise, a weariness with the world, a lack of belief in objective truth and so forth, more of a philosophical response, as it were, which goes along probably with the First World War and the destruction of the great powers at their own hands. Those sorts of things that will perhaps begin postmodernism, although often it's pegged to the 1960s and the sexual revolution and so forth there. But let's not get sidetracked by that. But you want to see it more as an aesthetic movement. You mentioned symbolism. Let me say one final thing here, because I'm listening to you and I'm finding it intriguing. The symbol is a concept that Coleridge actually speaks about. One of my academic areas of expertise is in the writing of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and he talks about the symbol, and it becomes really important thereafter, but not at the time. And in general, I think Coleridge has been appropriated by those that come afterwards to be say, well, he's talking about initiating the same sort of thing, aestheticism, in other words. But I don't agree, and I've never agreed, and I don't think that's what he's talking about when he's talking about the symbol. He's talking about spiritual truths being wedded to material things, so the natural supernaturalism, and specifically talking about the imagination and the way it conjoins these two things. But that's not what you're talking about in the symbol. This is now a more or less a crass materialism and an aestheticism that disconnects beauty from goodness and truth. Is that not right?
Yes, this is where we're going to go. So what happens, they start off by exploring in their literature, both the symbolists and the aesthetes, the connection between the concrete and the abstract, the real and the ideal, and then they begin to connect these things in turn with those two poles of values that you and I have been talking so much about, aesthetics on the one hand and ethics on the other hand. This is a big flashpoint in history for that discussion, and it starts with the symbolists. They kick it off for us, to the best of my knowledge. Like I said, the taproot might run even deeper. In fact, it probably does. If I was,
it runs all the way back to Hume, I think, because he is going to attack the idea of the fact. He makes what he calls the fact value distinction, that we can't make assertions about values as if they were facts. We can make objective statements about those things, but not about values. And so he begins the whole process. But still,
yeah,
that's in the background, and most people won't trace it back to Hume. But I would say I would want to connect it there.
Yeah, this is another thing that's curious about the symbolists and the aesthetes, and Oscar Wilde is a particularly high profile individual.
He's a flamboyant example, and he's an illustration of it in his own person. He's like Lord Byron, right? He is his own. Every time Wilde presents something in literature, people think he's talking about himself. And he probably is. And likewise with Byron. And he not only doesn't discourage it, he probably encourages that,
He does,
right? He
yes.
can play it. So, and that leads to his personal notoriety. And also there's a cult of Oscar Wilde that grows out of it, just like there is with Byron.
Yes, we're going to have to talk about that because that cult grows up for some clear reasons. But yeah, he's narcissistic. He is unapologetically narcissistic, and his narcissism is actually celebrated in certain circles. But we'll talk about the underpinnings of that in just a bit. The symbolists and the aesthetes are very erudite people, and so oftentimes they're throwing around some very complicated thinking and complicated works and stuff like this. But one of the things readers should be aware of, or listeners in our case should be aware of, is that their knowledge on certain subjects is spotty. So you encounter surprising gaps in some of the things they like talking about, and which make them very, very passionate. So again, we'll come back and we'll talk about Wilde in particular on these fronts here. But yeah, let me lay out this notion here. Oscar Wilde, like all the others, is fascinated with tension between concrete and ideal, with the real and super real and all this kind of stuff. And they tend to begin attaching the aesthetic values to the ideal, to the thing that the symbol represents. And then they leave ethics kind of in the realm of the material and the concrete and the lived experience and kind of stuff like that. And they kind of go to war with ethics for the sake of promoting aesthetics. So they're a common notion you'll hear them articulate, and Wilde articulates this in numerous points in his writings, both his literature and also his more polemical writings like The Art of Lying, where he talks about how the only proper job of art is beauty. And if you try to force a didactic ethical tenor upon it, it will crush and kill the work of art. And so they actually, following on from the symbolists here, by the way, Oscar Wilde is one of the great plagiarists of the 19th century. He oftentimes gets credit for things that are not his, and he doesn't correct anybody. But in any event, this connects with the artists in these movements courting ethical violations according to middle-class sensibilities, precisely as a mark of honor to show how deeply committed they are to purely aesthetic, non-ethical art. And so oftentimes you'll hear people say, like Algernon in the play says, you know, who cares what the French really say as long as they say it beautifully. That is a typical kind of polemical statement Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater and John Ruskin and Baudelaire and all the others would tend to say.
And Harold Bloom, for that matter.
Yes, so beauty resides in the style with which a work of art is communicated and not in its content. And if you can get your brain around that, all of a sudden, a lot of what the aesthetes are doing, a lot of what the symbolists are doing, and by way of extension, a lot of what the modernists are doing in the future comes clear. Flaubert in prose form does the same sort of thing. He used to like bragging, because he's a writer who's rather contemporary with the symbolists here. He used to like bragging that his stories were about pure style of expression. There were stories about nothing, he boasted. They're about nothing. Why are they about nothing? So you don't get distracted by the content. The style with which it's articulated, on the other hand, is where the aesthetic value is going to lay. So let's put all the focus on that as powerfully as we can. We'll evacuate our play of all content. And to some extent, we see that with this play that Wilde has presented us with here as well. The things that occur are not dreadfully important. These are not earth-moving, gigantic, epic, tragic concerns as we're going to encounter in a Shakespearean tragedy or a Greek tragedy or something like this. They're ridiculous people doing ridiculously small things, but that's not an accident. That's deliberate. I've got a lot more to say about this, but let's come back and talk maybe a little bit about Wilde himself. The symbolists and the aesthetes.
So what's his era, first of all, Bill?
I'm just going to put him in the late 19th century. I don't even want to call it the late Victorian period.
Well, 1854, he dies in 1900, so he is a man of the 19th century, but we don't tend to think of him that way.
Yeah, his influence on the 19th or on the 20th century is so powerful, though, that a lot of people will include him in literary surveys of 20th century literature.
Yep.
And I think they're right to do that. I do that.
Yep.
Because this.
And he doesn't seem very Victorian, does he?
No, he's anti-Victorian. If whatever is typically Victorian, the aesthetes, including Oscar Wilde, hate. They set up the great
dichotomy there.
Yeah, the great vilification of the Victorians that's going to occur just after World War I by Lytton Strachey, but we'll talk about that in later podcasts.
Yeah, you mentioned that last time, though.
Yeah, so Strachey's has fertile ground with which to work because the aesthetes and Oscar Wilde in particular have been busy for many, many years before the Great War actually takes place. There was another thing I was going to say there, but went past me.
He's Irish?
He's Irish. He's Anglo-Irish, though. This is important as well.
Mm-hmm.
He dies of
He's a notorious homosexual.
Yes,
who was put on trial for it, for that matter, sort of a celebrity trial,
and spent time in jail for it. I think he spent 2 years in Reading jail.
Yeah,
and he died ultimately of meningitis.
Yes.
We'll get around to the
Which
events.
Is a pretty horrible way to die, I have to say.
It is awful. It is awful. And unfortunately, most people who know about Oscar Wilde, first and foremost, know him as a famously controversial homosexual at a very pivotal time for that movement in Western history.
Yeah.
And they don't really know much about his philosophy, such as it is. They don't really know much about his art. You know that probably his highest quality piece of work is the picture of Dorian Gray.
I think so, which is why I was unhappy with talking about the importance of being earnest. But having said that, I understand the rationale for it. Wilde is a bright man, so this is, so everything that we're saying about and probably indicting about his aestheticism is not born of the idea that he's a shallow man or without any learning. He grew up learning and speaking French and German. He studied greats because at the time, this is what one do in the 19th century. So he studied Greek and Latin.
Yep.
And he was exceptional at that as well. So his linguistic gifts are without dispute. But he takes it in a direction, and the study probably of the Greco-Roman world in a direction that would probably espouse the moralism of that period. And in other words, it's really in some ways a rejection of Christianity, Christian mores.
Yeah. He's tied in also with a lot of other movements and thinkers in England at this time. So we talked about the symbolists and what's going on there. We haven't really talked about some of the other figures. Oscar Wilde is taken under the wing of Walter Pater, a name fewer people know, unfortunately, who espouses many of these sort of aesthete ideas. And John Ruskin, but John Ruskin is a bit of a different animal in some senses. Because John Ruskin is very socially oriented. He's very sincere. Oscar Wilde goes out of his way to underscore the fact that he is insincere about absolutely everything. He takes it to epic proportions. His most famous essays, I think the full name is The Decay of the Art of Lying, which is riffing off of some classical essays and things like this as well, which makes for hair-raising reading. And I'm going to come across with 4 points, the 4 key points of that later on today, but not right now. He's also tied into another extremely important late Victorian group, the Pre-Raphaelites, people like the Rossettis and so on. Yes, the painters, and they too are very interested in decadence and presenting decadent content in exquisitely beautiful style again. So you see how this is a leitmotif that keeps occurring even in different schools of thinking in the Victorian period. And
they are devotees of Keats. So we've talked about something about the romantic inheritance here. I think we have to acknowledge that there. Keats's philosophy is there in the aesthetics, the aesthetic movement here as well, without a doubt.
Yeah, this is where I trace the influence of the Romantics onto the thinking, cultural and artistic and literary thinking of the late 19th century. I think it comes in primarily through that avenue there.
Keats and Shelley.
Yeah, and I should also mention here, while we're talking about decadent content, again, this is not something the aesthetes invent, providing really decadent, disgusting content in beautifully articulate, exquisite even forms. So I can remember the first time I read Baudelaire's Chagon, the corpse essentially is what it comes down to. And I'm not going to reiterate what the poem talks about, but my goodness, what a schism between what's the discovery of a rotting corpse in the sun and the flies and the maggots and all these sorts of horrible things and the movements and it just gets worse from there. but the mode of expression was of the opposite extreme. So while the content evoked a response of disgust, deep visceral disgust, the mode in which Baudelaire talks about it is breathtaking. It's beautiful. It's cultured. It's poised. That's a typical symbolist and aesthete move. Now, Wilde takes it in certain directions of his own for his own polemical reasons. I should also say a little bit about that. Why is it that Oscar Wilde is oftentimes being sought out in sort of a cultish sense? Because you raised this point, and it's a good point. This is one of the ironic developments on the part of both interrelated schools of thinking. They violently and ferociously reject the values of the middle class and try to disgust them and anger them and even provoke them. And as I said before, this is a mark of honor. This is how deeply committed they are to their principles. Insofar as they're this powerfully and viscerally committed to their principles, they come across as screaming of artistic integrity, which makes them ironically figures of admiration by exactly those unlearned masses. They now know that they don't know because they've been mocked for not knowing it. And so they feel that they need to know more. And where am I going to get my knowledge from? From precisely the people who are provoking and insulting me. And because the symbolists and especially the aesthetes are very pedantic and, as you already said, or I already said, narcissistic, this appeals to their ego. And so ironically, these people who are insulting the middle classes are being surrounded by
the middle
comparatively unlearned middle class people who are devotees of these figures. And this becomes a pattern that you see into the 20th century. It's not just Oscar Wilde. There's a bunch of these people who specialize in going on tour and insulting middle classes and being followed around slavishly by their worshipers. Oscar Wilde so much that he literally monetizes that. He goes first on one and then a second great American tour. And the tour, I think his first tour, he starts in New York and then he starts lecturing on aestheticism and its principles. This is why the philosophy is so important, because it was literally lectured on by a celebrity. But his lecture series in the United States is so successful commercially that they extended to, I think it was just about over a year before they let him go and he escaped back to England. But he would return for a second speaking tour later on in life as well, promoting the same sorts of ideas. So the ideas aren't just being discussed in private salon amongst a few artistic elite. They're being spread to the masses. So the influence is coming from both levels here. And I think that's also important to keep in view.
Very interesting. And he is on the, I would say, on the aggression as well. So he, we mentioned his homosexuality. He had a lover, an aristocrat, Lord Alfred Douglas, and Wilde actually prosecuted his father for criminal libel because his father objected to their relationship and so forth, and Wilde accused him of libel. Of course, the Marquis of Queensberry produced evidence that demonstrated that what he was saying was true, and of course that ended up putting Wilde in prison. But again, there was he's not just a provocateur. There's more to it than that. There's an aggression about it and an anger, and a really, to some degree, and you presented this quite well, an adherence and a devotion to beauty, which cloaks a deep-seated ugliness. And the picture of Dorian Gray is a good symbol of that, because of course the picture of Dorian Gray is this beautiful youth, but underneath that is this rotting, horrible figure. And again, and that we'll get into this in a bit, I think that this is what he displays rather well in the importance of being earnest with his two protagonists. They have alter egos, and it's something akin to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They each have a Mr. Hyde character who is an immoral, disreputable individual in some ways, and they they hide that individual to some degree, or at least they mention that person, but it's a fictitious person in this case. Whereas in the case of Stevenson's novel, it was actually the individual Dr. Jekyll himself who was experimenting on himself with drugs and so forth. But still, this idea of an alter ego, and so there's something of a dramatic feature to this. Maybe we'll talk about this in a minute, Bill, but that is almost Shakespearean. Like there are two twins and they don't know of each other's identity. Well, it's a variation on that. And what Wilde does with this is to attack, as you say, middle class Victorian values.
Yeah. It's yeah, this the Geminata,
Right.
this twinning notion here, which runs way, way back, obviously, right down into classical mythology and things of this sort.
Yes.
But you're right. Oscar Wilde, there's no doubt that the play is it's superbly crafted play. Whatever else you want to say about it, it is. And second of all, this is something you and I haven't talked about. Oscar Wilde is known with some reason as one of the wittiest writers who has ever written. And it's true. The man is enormously clever. You see lots of displays of wit by writers in the 19th century in particular. But Oscar Wilde is right up there at the top of the list. We talked about the wit of Jane Austen at the beginning of the century.
Yes.
But here at the end of the century, we encounter another enormously witty individual, and this is one of the things that this play delivers so well. But I don't want to lose this idea that you mentioned here about the twinning. It's not just twinning, it's not just having an alter ego. By the way, plot spoiler coming up, so if you haven't watched the play yet, stick your fingers in your ears and yell la 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 at this point. The alter ego of both men aren't just alter egos.
No.
They are moral and ethical alter egos. One of
Good.
them is good and virtuous, and the other one is wicked and evil. And this is
That's
the
why I
Dr.
mentioned
Jekyll,
Dr.
Mr.
Jekyll,
Hyde.
Mr. Hyde, and not just the Shakespearean doubles. Yeah.
Yes, that's absolutely on the mark. That is on target. So in the case of Algernon, he's got his friend Bunbury, who he's always
Bunbury.
having to, yes, and Bunbury's getting himself into constant troubles. Why is he getting into constant trouble? Because he's a bad man. That's why he gets into constant trouble. And Jack, of course, in the city is known as Earnest, and Earnest can get up to all sorts of shenanigans. And every now and again, Jack in the country has to go back to see his alter ego and get him out of scrapes.
Whose name is Earnest.
Whose name is Earnest. And of course, well, the one thing neither one of these guys is being earnest about his actual identity, which of course goes to the title, The Importance of Being Earnest. So
plays on words, in other words.
Yes, very much. This is a common Wildinian kind of a tactic. But the men are, how to put this here? Mallarmé, the famous symbolist poet, insisted that morals and ethics have nothing to do with aesthetics and beauty. Yes. If you want to point to one guy who's actually split and divorced those two sets of values, which had been wedded up to that point since the time of the ancient Greeks, then it's the symbolists. I oftentimes hear Nietzsche giving credit for this, but Nietzsche plays off of it here. The symbolists really get this ball rolling. Mallarmé is probably our number one guy here to do that. And this is a talking point you hear raised in the 20th century again and again and again. How can all these people who are so well educated and cultured in the arts and learning do such horrific things, like they become death camp commandants and stuff like this?
Yeah, fair enough.
Clearly, this just underscores the point that art has nothing to do with goodness. And I think that is an enormously problematic assertion.
It's a false conclusion is what it is.
Yes.
But it is, however, there is something correct about it, which is that divorce of beauty from goodness does lead to those things. Now that, I would say, is a fair hypothesis, at any rate, that people who have divorced their aesthetics from their morality are less resistant to doing evil acts, and they are capable of indulging them without any restraining moral objections, any conscience, because conscience no longer has any play. It has no hold upon them. And when you've done this, and this gets picked up over and over. Now, I really think it's interesting that you say that beauty and goodness are seen to be unified, or at least connected, as far back as the ancient Greeks. This is not simply a Christian invention.
No.
Although in the Middle Ages, in the context of the university, beauty, truth, and goodness are united in the person of God, and He is the essence of these three things. That's true. But even the Greeks acknowledged the importance of beauty and goodness, each of them and both of them, and their interrelation, and that's presented in the liberal arts even. So remember, music is part of the quadrivium. It's a science.
Yes.
right? So it's seen as objective and real, connected with mathematics and the astronomy, the way the heavens comport themselves and so forth. So this is a breach, a significant breach, not with the Victorian period, but with the whole of Western history, and not just Christian history, but the entirety of it. So it is the great divorce, and it's what C.S. Lewis writes upon when he writes The Abolition of Man. That is really a treatise about education, but he is precisely touching on the rejection of moral value and aesthetic value as objectively true. He says this is the repudiation of all education if we hold this view. Well, when he says it, it's now a standard for not only his era, but at least since the time of Wilde, for people to gravitate towards this view.
Yeah, the aesthetes are amorally intoxicated by the good life. And when they say the good life, they mean the most refined aesthetic life they can possibly lead.
Decadence.
Yes, and its outplay is oftentimes decadence, which they then flaunt both in their lifestyle and their art at the middle classes, just to underscore the fact that their values are different. A lot of people don't know that the ancient Greeks, obviously pre-Christian, Greek education undergoes two phases, according to modern historians. And the first phase, old school, rather than higher education, it's centered on two things: intellectual and physical training in the gymnasium.
Yep.
And the intellectual training in old school Greek education was primarily, before we see the trivium and the quadrivium kind of take over under various individuals, it is primarily concerned with the appreciation of beauty. And a lot of my students find that shocking. Like, really, that's the thing. They weren't teaching engineering. They weren't teaching mathematics. They weren't teaching it. No, they were teaching an appreciation for beauty. Why? Because you were going to have to be, from 508 on in Athens, you were going to have to be a responsible citizen who was going to contribute to the good running, the Athenian democracy well. You are a part of that. You're part of the kratos. You're part of the power of that. And the number one thing they wanted cultivated in that kind of a voting democratic citizen was somebody who knew beauty and understood it at a deep, rich level. And we don't have time to explore why that is, but it's a fascinating thesis on the good, on a well-educated democratic citizen. Why is it that they insisted on that of all things? Because I guarantee you, our current age would not come to any such conclusion.
And what's really interesting is that although Plato agrees with this, he just doesn't think that the demos is up to it. He thinks it's the aristocrats alone who are able to pursue this goal, but he doesn't dispute the importance of that goal. He thinks that it's vital.
Yes, that never gets undermined by any of the major Greek contributors to Greek education. In some senses, in philosophy, that's a bit of a different discussion. But you see this picked up again with this notion of plebeians and patricians in later Roman, the rise of the Roman culture. The patricians are the ones who are in charge of these sorts of the running of the res publica, the republic. And the plebeians only over time begin to contribute to that after some outrages. Anyway, to come all the way back here, the divorce of goodness from beauty, which I would argue happens in its most important phase right here on Oscar Wilde's watch.
Fair enough.
Is what facilitates any number of horrors in the later 20th century. And that's why I insist on talking about the aesthetes in relation to modernism and postmodernism and all these sorts of things. But you won't get that at the first remove if you read The Importance of Being Earnest. It's about two young men who are, as you say, decadent. They are both of them aesthetes. And of course, this is being celebrated in various ways.
But they don't present themselves that way. They present themselves as morally upright Victorian gentlemen.
Yes, and the foil, if we're talking about foils here, the foil against which they do that to a large extent is the formidable and dragonish Lady Bracknell, who is, by the way, superbly played in the 1952 version, movie version of the play. I would say, in fact, if you're going to watch any version of The Importance of Being Earnest, the one that does it most articulately, the most artistically, the best is the 1952 Technicolor
okay, I haven't seen it. That's great.
It's it's available on YouTube. It's part of the Criterion Collection, and it is, if you're a real connoisseur of such things, it is great, and it makes the two later movie versions of The Importance of Being Earnest look incredibly crude, knuckle-dragging kind of garish ugliness. Anyway, Lady Bracknell, as I said, is superbly portrayed in the 52 version. And she is all that is wrong with Victorian middle class, in this case, pseudo-aristocratic sensibilities. She is a hypocrite. She is venal. She is materialistic. She is calculating, but she nevertheless puts on a completely hypocritical air of being virtuous and honorable and philanthropic and all these other sorts of things. When, of course, we discover as the play goes on, she is anything but, especially when it comes to negotiating bride prices, if you like.
I got the sense that Wilde hated this woman.
You know what? He actually did. She's based on a real woman.
Mm-hmm.
She is based on the wife of the man who ended up taking him to court. Douglas Murray's mother is
the
the
Marquess of
model
Queensberry.
for. Yes, so Douglas Murray's mother is the model for Lady Bracknell, and that was explicitly acknowledged by Oscar Wilde. And you are absolute. Your instincts are absolutely on the money. He loathed her. More than he actually loathed the Marquis himself. So there you go. So the story itself, predictably, is about 2/4 young men who are each of them in pursuit of a young woman who they seek to marry. We've got Cecily Cardew on the one hand, and we've got Gwendolyn on the other hand, also superbly portrayed in or acted in the 1952 version. In fact, all the acting in the 52 version is good.
Actors were better then. Sorry.
It's just that simple. But of course, nowadays, I'm not sure people have the refined sensibilities to appreciate what they're looking at. So,
yeah.
As Eudora Welty later said, in the 20th century, we have to use loud, screeching, melodramatic forms because nobody will hear anything else anymore. Yeah. But in any event, the 52 version does catch a lot of that subtlety. And for reasons that are not fully explained, both of the women are intent on only marrying a man named Earnest. So that's going to be a problem. And both men try to get themselves rechristened while they're out at Jack's place in the country. There's a whole dichotomy between city mouse, country mouse kind of thing going on because they are bad, decadent men in the city, but they are seemingly virtuous men in the country. So there's a whole conversation waiting to start there. I'm not going to get into it unless you get into it. And one of the things that Wilde is responding to, it mocks everything, everywhere, in every direction that he possibly can. He's an aesthete. It's one of the things they do. And one of the things he's mocking is the dramatic form that he's responding to, the Victorian play. And it's actually got a name. It's the well-made play with all caps at the front. That's its proper name. The well-made play will find its way to teaching you didactically proper morals and ethics, oftentimes from a breathtakingly crude perspective. The well-made play will end well, even if it is wildly improbable. If the happy ending is wildly improbable, doesn't matter. The well-made play doesn't care. It's going to give you the happy ending. The two heroes will embrace at the end. A marriage will come out of this, and you will have been taught several life lessons in the process of these plays.
Excellent.
I've watched a couple of these, and I will not watch a third. I can tell you, Wilde has a point.
They're well made. Come on.
Well, the irony, of course, is exactly in that. They were well made according to middle-class sensibilities. And you could probably come up with modern television and movie analogs to our own current version of the well-made play.
Yeah, it'd be a Disney movie.
Yeah, and so
recently.
So if you get to the end of the importance of being earnest and you think this is a wildly contrived happy ending, what the heck is going on here? Know that Wilde is responding to a long tradition of what he considers to be bad drama, and he writes his bad ending precisely in order to send up the typical wildly improbable happy endings of the well-made play. Yeah. So
that explains it for me.
There you go. Now
I thought it was entirely contrived in a ridiculous ending. And
you were meant to.
Yes. But I lacked the knowledge of the period to know that he was sending up his contemporaries in the process.
I don't know how important that knowledge is, but you file away sometimes garbage along with the good stuff, so it's up there.
No, it's good to know.
So it does
it makes me appreciate him a bit more, because quite frankly I thought it was wildly clever, to pardon the pun. Mm-hmm. But then when it came to the ending, I thought this is such a terrible ending, how it doesn't fit the play in its cleverness, at least. Mm-hmm. And at least this excuses it. So this is another species of cleverness, that even in the end, the punch is the punch that he directs at his audience and his fellow playwrights. There you go. Gotcha. Yeah.
There you are. Yes. In case, again, more plot spoilers, people. The character of Jack is an orphan who has been adopted.
Found in a handbag.
He's found in a handbag, and the 52 version is portrayed as a Gladstone bag.
Okay.
And it was his nurse or his nanny, Miss Chasuble. So not Mrs. Chasuble, Miss Prism. It's Mr. Chasuble and Prism.
Yes.
Prism, bring me that baby. That's a line from 52, by the way.
Okay.
And yeah, his nanny is writing a novel, as middle-class women do. They all read novels, they all write novels, everyone's writing a novel. Again, Oscar Wilde is commenting back to current sensibilities. He's mocking this notion that the novel is ridiculously middle class and primarily a woman's obsession. There's a bit of misogyny on the part of Oscar Wilde. People don't
I think it's there all the time.
Yeah, and should just note that in passing. But she's got her manuscript in one Gladstone bag, and she mixes things up, and I think she puts the manuscript in the preambulator, and she puts the baby in the handbag, and then she takes the preambulator and forgets the handbag at the station, and he's discovered on a railway platform, and he's adopted by rich parents, and so on and so forth.
Of course he is.
Of course he is. Is that also ridiculously melodramatic and contrived and over the top? Yeah. Is it also deliberate as a piece of satire and mockery on the part of Wilde? Yes, it is. Is it clever as such? Yes, I suppose I have to admit it is. So there's a lot of background knowledge you need to understand a lot of what Wilde is doing. Background context is so important for proper satire to function, and so we need it with Oscar Wilde as well.
For satire, above all, it really is. You need that. Otherwise, it doesn't bite, and satire has to bite, right? So you have to know what it's biting at. And if it's not, if it doesn't fit your context, then the satire misses its mark.
Yeah. And so what is the ultimate significance of the importance of being earnest? And I do get asked that by students. What exactly was Wilde trying to do other than maybe mock some ridiculous tendencies in Victorian middle class art and sensibilities and so on and so forth? And I would argue, if you have to ask that question, you've missed Oscar Wilde's entire point. It's art for its own sake. In fact, oftentimes that saying art for art's sake is accredited to Oscar Wilde himself. In point of fact, it's Oscar Wilde reiterating a symbolist notion by Gautier, I think it is, l'art pour l'art, art for its own sake.
It's always the French.
It's always the French. But typically when I hear people give credit for that slogan, because it's a very famous slogan, when they give credit for the slogan, they give it to Oscar Wilde when it's not Oscar, sorry. But Oscar knew that, took credit for it, and never corrected anybody. So there you go.
There you go. But the point is that the figures that represent duty and honor and Victorian gentlemanly conduct are hypocrites. So, and of course, we, the audience, are aware of that. But the point of that is a performative gesture demonstrating Wilde's own convictions about precisely those things. He's not just, this is not just incidental. It's almost a microcosm of Wilde's convictions about his contemporaries and about his audience, for that matter, and including those who are judging him and throwing him in prison for his conduct. Right? It's an angry gesture done in the most pleasing manner imaginable.
Yeah, you typify it as aggression and anger, and that's I think accurate. I would take it a little bit further. There's a viciousness about Oscar Wilde that at times, the smile of the satire seems to fade away, and you're left with this flat expression, and it's become sarcasm, and it's become viciousness, and there's a chilling side to Oscar Wilde, and no mistake. He was married. A lot of people seem to forget that awkward fact. He was married and he had 2 children. He was so disgusted by the prospect of seeing the second birth or having anything to do with the second birth that this is where he began all sorts of extramarital affairs with young men.
I heard about that.
Yeah, and he effectively abandons his family. People tend not to talk about that either.
The same thing with Rousseau, right?
Yes.
Anyway, never mind.
No, it's all to a point. There's a pattern here, to be sure. Let me give you very quickly also, just to inform a little more of his art. My four main takeaways from The Decay of the Art of Lying.
Yes, talk about that. You were going to get back to that. I was going to bring you
Yeah.
there.
So he says, first of all, art never expresses anything but itself. That's a famous slogan of his that he would chant from the podium when he would give his talks and speeches and what have you. So is there any further meaning to what the art expresses? No, the meaning is essentially circular. It's aesthetic meaning, and that is what it is, what it is. And because so many people no longer are making this distinction when he's lecturing, especially in the United States, between intrinsic value and instrumental value, this sounds like brilliant stuff. Because intrinsic value is something which is valued for its own sake. Wilde takes that, twists it, and disconnects it from its context and uses it for his own purposes.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think Terry Eagleton characterizes the Western tradition in precisely those terms at the outset of his work on literary theory. He says that is the tradition. And of course, that tradition is nonsensical, doesn't make any sense, literally.
Yeah, quite right. Quite right. So this is why people who come from this relatively aggressive, progressive perspective, for the perspective of the aesthetes and soon the avant-garde artiste, this is why they tend to respond to, when somebody asks, what's the significance of, or what's the meaning of this work of art, this work of literature, this painting, this musical composition, why they just look at each other and smirk in mockery, because it doesn't express anything beyond itself. And everybody knows that. Surely this person knows that. No, they don't. So obviously they don't belong. Connected to this here, he has this assertion, I'm quoting him here. All bad art comes from returning to life and nature, elevating this into ideals. So when we return to reality, that's how bad art happens. That's where, when we return to strict measurable truths, that's where bad art comes from, says Oscar Wilde. So you think about that. I'm not going to unpack that right now because there's so much to say there. I don't know where to even begin.
It's the repudiation of everyone who comes before him.
It's the repudiation also of reality.
Yeah, well, that's why. Yes.
Yeah. By the way, to speak back to an earlier point you made, actually, I thought it was a good point, that, the importance of bringing Earnest is a scathing send-up of the hypocrisy of the main figures, the hero figures, or at least the respectable figures of the play. But understand that Oscar Wilde himself is a raging hypocrite, and he knows it. And in some senses, insofar as the mimetic impulse is being elicited by the action of the play, in some sense, one gets the feeling that we're supposed to admire the hypocrisy of Algernon and Jack. And that,
just think about that. Just think about that in the context of where the word hypocrites comes from, at least from, I think, the popular understanding of that, which is a hypocrite is somebody who's an actor. He pretends to be something that he's not. Yes. It's a word that Jesus uses of the Pharisees, right? And it's a moral indictment. It's supposed to make the people being charged with hypocrisy recognize that they're doing something they ought not to do and to correct themselves. Not only does Wilde reject that, he embraces hypocrisy as something which ought to be loved for its own sake. Now, this is and I cannot think of a precedent for this in the history of ideas before this period. I cannot see it. So there's a degeneration that's happening at this point, which it's really unprecedented, and it's not exclusively connected to his homosexuality per se. That's just a part of it, and that's the sort of the flashpoint. But it's because again, homosexuals are in the Greek era as well, and they are not going to hold to this position about the divorce of beauty from goodness and truth. They're not going to do that, but Wilde does. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
Yeah, we forget when we read assertions like that, and when we see this played out here, the celebration, the backhanded celebration of hypocrisy. We have to remember that in his real life, such a thing really exists to Oscar Wilde, he's living that at a very deep, visceral level. He's living a life of considerable hypocrisy, and when the hypocritical veil is torn, as it were, he's charged and then he's sent to jail for a couple of years. So hypocrisy is a real thing to Oscar Wilde, and he seems to be celebrating it in the importance of being earnest, and is tied up with his sexuality, of course. He's got two more assertions. They're short, they're simple, they're punchy, as they're meant to be, because, of course, he's speaking from podiums from speaking venues. He says, life imitates art more than art imitates life. And that's become a fighting slogan also in certain progressive artistic circles right through the 20th century. Which imitates which? And of course, many people, especially if you're coming from a set of middle-class Victorian values, of course, your response is going to be no, art is an imitation of life. That's how the Renaissance artists thought
It's
about it.
mimesis.
Yeah, I look around me, I look at nature, I look at created reality, I look at my material circumstances and my theoretical context, historical context, and from that, I build art. That is the raw stuff of art. Well, remember, there is no raw stuff to much of the art of these individuals here. It's all style. It's all it is. It's all artistic craft and cleverness and stuff like this. And so they adopt a reverse position here. This, again, is a slogan meant to inflame sensibilities and anger people in the late 19th century. It's so if you find it controversial, then it's doing exactly what Oscar Wilde wanted it to do. If it's annoying you, then it's doing its job. And then finally, lying. The telling of beautiful, untrue things is the proper aim of art, says Oscar Wilde. This is why he's talking about the decay.
Is that a truth statement, or yeah?
You can say we have no access to truth according to Oscar Wilde.
Repeat that again, Bill.
Yeah. Lying, comma, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, comma, is the proper aim of the artist, or is the proper aim of art.
Lying is the proper aim of art.
Yeah, and he's borrowing, of course, he's hoping perhaps that we haven't read our Plato.
I was going to say.
Yeah, he's riffing off of Plato. Like a number of other writers in the late 19th century, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, Edgar Allan Poe, there's enormous amounts of unacknowledged borrowing here. And I don't think it's being done in the same sort of sense of a polymath like Samuel Taylor Coleridge or somebody else like this. He just doesn't remember where his thinking ends and somebody else's begins. These guys, on the other hand, seem to be deliberately covering up any ability to trace it back to a lot of the roots of their ideas. So again, this is typical Oscar Wilde.
So we talked about the rebellion against goodness, the divorce of beauty from goodness. Here it's the divorce of beauty from truth.
There's that too. Yes.
That's just part of the lying postulate, and art is predicated on lying.
Yep.
This is, again, it's an extraordinary statement to make. And is it Callicles and the Gorgias? I can't even remember where this statement comes by Plato. But it certainly is almost a sophistic claim of the sophists. And again, Socrates strongly advocates the really what ends up being the Western position on this. And everybody after Socrates is going to agree with Socrates pretty much against the sophists, up until Wilde, who I would say it's fair to say is a sophist. Then
I would go further. I would say he is a sophist with bells on, and at an epic level, and he knows it, and he celebrates it, and he rolls in it, and he glories in it. All there is sophistry at the end of the day, according to Oscar Wilde.
But note that you said following Wilde, there is an inheritance that follows it, and I trace it all the way to Harold Bloom, who is the last representative of the aesthetic tradition, and ironically fought against the postmodernists in his day, the schools of resentment, as he called them, the feminists, the post-colonialists, all these things, who weren't interested in beauty and were interested more in political agendas. He wanted nothing to do with that. Okay. But the aesthetic position that he represented was already a political position against the establishment.
Yeah, when Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater, and to a lesser extent John Ruskin and the Rossettis and all these people, when they are inveighing against crude middle-class moralizing art, this is something which passes on an inheritance here. And as you say, with the rise of postmodernism, literature begins to get increasingly preachy again, increasingly didactic.
Yes, it does.
It is not a surprise to me for a second that Harold Bloom would take issue with this as an aesthete. they always take issue with preachy art.
Of any sort.
And part of
And it
me is
doesn't have to be
sympathetic.
Christian. It would
Yeah.
have been Christian early on in Bloom's career, and it was. But by the 80s, it was against the preachiness of the modern left.
And to some extent, I'm sympathetic to what Bloom is saying, and in a different backhanded way, I am sympathetic to what the aesthetes are saying.
Me too.
Because art has a tendency to oscillate between either extremism on the aesthetic side, purely divorced from all judgments of character and ethics and goodness and all that kind of stuff. And then it will oscillate oftentimes in a compensatory way to the opposite extreme. And it's all nothing but super preachy, over the top stuff. And of course, you and I are living in an age like that right now. A lot of the art, most of the art being turned out and celebrated is over the top, super preachy art.
Yeah, so it's ironic that we have to draw people's attention to that, to the idea that literature is beautiful, and it's the features of that recommend it, and that is actually the distinctive mark of literature, is that it has beauty as its main aim, to delight as well as to teach.
Yes,
and that has dropped out of the discussion at the moment, that it ought to delight as well as to teach. It's just to teach.
Yes, up to the, and I'm generalizing again, up till about the middle of the 19th century, most learned men and women knew that you cannot divorce these two things and valorize one at the expense of the other. You have to be aware that ethical value and aesthetic value come as a package deal, and things get very problematic around art if you divorce them, if you separate them. So now you and I are having to talk about beauty and aesthetics nowadays because we're trying to compensate for the extremes of
ugliness in our day.
Yeah, ethical preaching, which is the only job of art.
Moralizing plus ugly. Modern art is unbelievable. When I say modern, contemporary art is unbelievably ugly.
Yes, it has no aesthetic value by any normal human, never mind historical traditional sensibility.
And at the same time, it's preachy.
It's enormously preachy. It's sanctimonious. It tends to be oftentimes breathtakingly simplistic. There's nothing like being lectured by a moron. Says he sneers down his nose at you, and you just have to take it and endure it. But if I'd been living in an earlier age where the aesthetics were completely owning the field of discussion and artistic endeavor, I'd probably be pushing back in the not so much the direction of ethics, but I would argue in the direction of character, which of course is connected to ethics. Yes. But my point here is that in order to have a solid, wholesome approach to art, you need to hold these two forms of value in mind and look at how they are inextricably linked in a good work of art. And that is something we've lost over the last 150 years or so, I would argue.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And it's been testified to by, again, I mentioned C.S. Lewis's work, The Abolition of Man. He talks directly about that issue. That it begins with the idea of the waterfall. Somebody says that it is sublime and or beautiful rather, and Coleridge objects and says that it's sublime. And there's an objection, or that this is quibbling about, and at the end of the day, these are merely subjective preferences that are being expressed by the audience, etc. And the educators agree with this, that this is a statement that has no objective validity whatsoever, and it's irrelevant. Let's get down to brass tacks here, and these are educators. Mm-hmm. This is, and at stake, Lewis says, is the entirety of the whole soul of education.
Yep.
And this is one of the reasons we're doing this series in Paideia Today, I think, is to try and recover the great tradition of literature and in its myriad of forms, and also to trace I would say, an enrichment over time because of Christianity largely, I would say, and also that now the decadence and decline from those great flourishing human works. And now we're in the 20th century largely. I think we're not going to see a great deal to recommend it, largely because it's of the milieu that comes out of what we've just talked about today, this art for art's sake.
Yeah, I mean, we start off with that distinction influentially, at least as early as Kant and Kantian distinctions about beauty being in a purely the provenance of the subject and the subjective and so on and so forth. It's in the eye of the beholder and so on and so forth. And then you have this oscillation back and forth between these two extremes. And yeah, I think sadly, I think future generations are going to look back at where we are right now with what we're turning out in our literature, turning out in our music, turning out in our painting and stuff like this.
Architecture. Look at the
Yeah,
look at the
architecture.
public
Yeah,
monuments of our day. Are there any?
yeah, and they're going to look at us a little bit like we look at the Hellenistic era. You know, there was a lot of pedantry in there, but you know, in terms of work of artistic or intellectual genius, it's a
There's
bit
a
of
lot
a
of sound and fury.
yeah. It's people would rather talk about art than actually talk art. And you know, we're kind of living in an age like that now, I think. But of course, obviously, I'm in the age, so I'm not terribly qualified to say so. Even so,
Anything more you want to say about?
yeah, let me leave you
important?
with a quotation, and this doesn't come
Good.
from Wilde. It comes from an influence on Wilde. I've already mentioned his name. This is Gautier, the guy who coined the art for art's sake, or l'art pour l'art. He says, quote, and this is obviously in translation, nothing is really beautiful unless it is useless. Now, you and I, of course, can immediately understand what he means by that. It's intrinsic value. That's the nature of art. It's not an instrument. But he takes it in a different direction. Everyday useful is ugly, for it expresses a need, and the needs of man are ignoble and disgusting, like his poor, weak nature. So we have a ringing condemnation of human character. The most useful place in the house is the lavatory. There you go. Yeah. So.
Not even the kitchen.
Not even the kitchen. It's the lavatory.
And Marquis de Sade would say the bedroom, but no, it's the lavatory.
It's the lavatory. We can go lower if you follow this school of thinking.
Yeah.
They can always go lower.
Yeah.
So is that to say that one should not read Oscar Wilde? No, you certainly should read your Oscar Wilde. He's important. The Picture of Dorian Gray will probably benefit you more than watching The Importance of Being Earnest, but the value of The Importance of Being Earnest is that it will also give you some degree of entertainment value, in my view. So it's in some senses, it's a different investment of your time,
Yeah.
rather than necessarily better. Dr. Masson, anything else you wanted to add to?
No, I think that's good. I mean, we wanted to open season 4 with Wilde, and particularly with the foundation for what we think follows Wilde, which is obviously, given its inauspicious beginnings, not going to be a delightful foray. We're going to be talking about works that we think are important, at times brilliant in some ways, and there are obviously contradictions to the general tenor, but the general tenor is this is a dark period, which we're going to try and catalog and to expose and to some degree enlighten our audience on.
Yes, you and I were joking beforehand that we've been singing the praises of many authors before this, and we've been going on through season after season, where in the main that's what we're doing. We're trying to help people see the value of these great authors in the great conversation. But as we move into season 4, you and I are going to increasingly become grumpy old men.
Which of course comes natural to some of us.
It's true. Now, luckily, it's not all
Present
doom
company
and gloom.
excluded.
We've got some absolutely wonderful authors in the 20th century that we want to look at as well.
Yeah.
But not all of them can be described thusly.
No, it's not the dominant strain for sure. At any rate, so next week we are going to look at Houseman and Hardy, and then we'll move on through authors like Conrad and Auden and Eliot and Orwell and Yeats and Flannery O'Connor and so forth. I've just mentioned a few. And I think it will be hopefully enlightening, and it will certainly come closer to home for our audience. But anyway, that was us for today. Once again, I mentioned our website. The website should be coming soon, paideiatoday.com. And hopefully it'll be up soon. And then we'll be able to talk to you more about what we're planning for days ahead. But that's us for today and this episode of Paideia Today. I'm Dr. Scott Masson with my colleague Bill Friesen. That's it for now, and see you next week.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.